Hello, and welcome to the Wade Borth podcast. I'm your host, Wade Borth, and in every episode, my goal is to get you to think differently about how money works and ultimately to empower you to take control of your money and your personal financing system. Hello, and welcome back to a very special Wade Borth podcast. Today, we are celebrating our 100th podcast. So let's hear a little from the crowd what they think about that. Woo, yeah. Okay, enough of the cheesy background noise. Today I have Mike Brevik is going to be joining me, and rightfully so. So let me give you a little background on Mike. Mike, he works with me. He's my marketing man. He is the guy that does way more of the marketing. He helps me kind of focus and look at things and how we want to get our message out to people. Mike is the one that we kicked around for, Mike, a better part of a year. I need to do a podcast. I resisted it like crazy because I didn't know that I had that much to say. And so Mike says, you need to do a podcast. We started. It floundered a little bit at the beginning, but it has been going strong now for over a year. And now we are at the 100th podcast. So thank you, Mike, for your persistence, for your visions. This has been I've had more fun doing this outlet of getting the message out to the listeners and to those people that are around me that want to hear my message. And this has been a great medium to get that out. So thank you so much for your persistence and for your guidance and your vision that guided me down this pathway. So again, Mike Brevik from Cyberdogz Marketing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Wade. And I think one observation I'll throw in there too, that you probably don't realize this until you go through it, but I think the exercise or the journey of building out a podcast and the different topics and the guests, it really is a calibration process for your brand as well. So I think at the beginning of it, like you said, I don't really know that I have that much to say. Well, now, like you said, we're hitting this 100th episode, and it's apparently I had a lot to say, and I had a lot to say in a variety of different ways, and I had a lot to say to a variety of different people. And hopefully in this process, it's helped you kind of calibrate your own methods and how you teach IBC to your clients.
Yeah, it has. It's been real helpful from that standpoint to really focus in on those things that are the most important to me, right? So somebody would think, oh, you're doing 100 podcasts, you're getting very broad. And I think what's happened is I've narrowed it down. I've become very deep. It's a little bit narrower, but now the message has become very deep around IBC and really about empowerment. I look at those things that are ultimately the most important things to me from a characteristics or from a value standpoint, right? So I want people thinking long-term. So we're talking about things that are very long-term. I want people to understand that the knowledge that they need and have is all within them. So the power rests within them to be able to do whatever they want to do. And this is for my clients, those that aren't clients, future clients, or whatever it might be. Anybody that can get that message from me is I go back to my farming background. It's like, what you want to cultivate is this knowledge that you have inside you. But our garden, our field has been inundated with weeds. And so my job is to help you either through the podcast or conversations with me is to get rid of those weeds in the garden. And so you want to cultivate and grow that you want to become. And so it's been very helpful along that lines. And it's about empowerment and really to lead to this feeling of freedom and control that people want and that I want for people. And that's why those people that are listening to this podcast probably are what I would consider my people, because that's the same thing that they want. And ultimately to take this to the next generation, make it family generational so we can get people out of bondage of lack of knowledge and lack of control that they have in their financial world. So it's been super helpful to kind of focus in on that. And then a lot of the podcasts I've done have been around empowerment and also opportunities. So that's why I think this podcast has been real helpful about getting myself to focus along that message.
Yeah. Do you feel like that's translated to your clients? Obviously, you have listeners and you have people that are consuming the content, but have you had any clients come to you and say, hey, this really reinforced, or it kind of took my own education to the next level? Do you have an example, basically, is what I'm saying, of somebody that's responded to it?
Yeah, it was interesting. I was talking, the funny part is he wasn't a client. He just ran into him. He goes, oh, I caught your podcast. I didn't know this gentleman I've never met him before. He goes, I caught your podcast. And when we kind of traced it back, a friend of his, it was a client of mine, and that referred him to the podcast. And the interesting part that he was making was, he goes, I sat and he had a drive, he had like a 10-hour drive. So he listened to 10 hours of content of mine. And I was floored, quite honestly. I was a little, you listen to 10 hours of my content, and I was humbled by that. I'm like, holy smokes, I'm making an impact in this guy's life. And he's like, the things you're talking about, nobody else is talking about. And he says, and I'm making changes in my life to make those things, which is control, right? He wanted control of this banking function. And he said, I listened to that series you did about becoming your own banker. And it's funny, we'll get into that a little bit later. But he said, I listened to that whole series, and it's like 28 podcasts. And I'm like, and I was just impressed. And he says, that's what I was looking for. That's absolutely what I needed. So now we're having discussions. I believe he's going to be a client of mine. But it was that feeling that he had, he was excited, right? That excitement that he was bringing to the conversations, like, I found what I was looking for. And if my message would have been very broad, I don't know that I would have had that impact on him.
Well, and that's what's interesting about any podcast really is I wouldn't even call it sales, but it's a low barrier education tool. It's meant for enjoyment, consumption, education, those kinds of things. So it's at the discretion of the listener. So if they like what you're saying, like you said, I don't know if I've listened to 10 hours of your podcast consecutively. So if for this guy to bite on that and to take 10 hours in a sitting like that, good for him. But at the same time, it definitely proves that the information and what you're doing matters to at least one person. And I got to believe there's probably lots and lots of people just like him out there that are doing the same thing. You just haven't heard about it.
Yeah, I've had existing clients, when I've had a conversation or a review of their policies, or we're having a conversation, they go, oh yeah, I caught your podcast on so-and-so or whatever it might be. And so they hear it, and it's kind of reinforcing the same conversation we had before. And you can tell that it's making an impact. And that's really gratifying to me. It's like, I want to get this message out. I want to empower people to take control of that function in their lives that they're desperately needing. And so we've started some people down that path already. And this is just either reinforcing it or giving them some fuel in their tank to go work at it even harder, right? So that was just probably the most extreme. I don't know that I've listened to 10 hours of my own content, right? I say it all day long, but to sit down and listen to, that was huge, to sit and listen on a road trip to this idea of what I had to say, and it made that big of an impact on his life. So that was huge. But existing clients are using it to reinforce the conversations we've had in the past. And I kind of laugh. I said, you probably heard some of those stories. You've probably heard some of those anecdotes that I've used in the past as well. And he goes, yeah, but he says, I kind of forgot about them until I heard about them. Now I see, because they're seeing from a different light as they go along. And that's the fun part, is they're hearing the same message that maybe that I had with them a year ago, 2 years ago, 15 years ago, when they first became clients. And now they're hearing it again, but it's from a different light, their experience in life and what they've done has now changed how they hear and what they're doing with it. So it's fun being able to put it in a podcast form to where now they can go back a year or two previous and go, oh yeah, that's what you're saying. Now it makes complete sense to how I'm living my life differently. And now, because the client was saying, I didn't necessarily understand what you were saying at the time, but now it makes complete sense because now I'm hearing it with a different ear, with a different light.
Yeah. So I know this is a topic you know very well, because obviously you're working in it and with people on it all the time. Mm-hmm. Having kind of committed to sit down and record these podcasts, and like you said, number 100 right here, how has your thought process evolved, and how has it sharpened your tools in the toolbox, so to speak? Because you're kind of forced to explain it in different ways, and you're put in different scenarios, whether it's a guest or whether it's just a standalone episode. How has it changed you?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting because I've had I love having guests on my podcast because I can hear and understand what they're doing. And then I'm trying to take their point of view as like, okay, how does what I'm trying to teach, mesh up with what they're doing? And how does it solve the same problem that they're running into with their clients? Because I'm a firm believer in addition. If I can there's the old adage, one and one, everybody thinks is two. I look at it as 1 and 1 being 11, right? And so if I can bring value to them and they're bringing value to me and to their listeners or their customers, and I can do the same with my customers, my listeners, we can create tremendous value. So there's a synergistic relationship. So that's been one thing that's been real helpful, is like trying to listen to what they're really telling me and what their pain points are. And maybe we have a solution, and maybe we have a way to help their clients and their people, as well as with what I offer, and then my clients and my listeners with what they have to offer. That to me is tremendous value I think we're bringing to people. Not that it works every time, because we've had multiple people from different industries and ways of life and thought processes. And I'm like, bring them all on, because the more I know, the better off we're going to be, right? It's never, right. I never want to get in an echo chamber where I'm only talking to people that think exactly like I do. I love having people on that go, hey, I don't know about that, and kind of challenge each other going back and forth, because it helps me craft my message outside of those that are within my same group, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that said, is there an episode that stands out to you where, like, I know you've done a lot of them, but of the 99 you've done, is there one that stands out where you're like, I really enjoyed that one for this reason?
There are probably a couple that I consider my favorite podcast, and it's not because of any particular reason. Well, there's a couple of reasons behind it. One of my favorite reasons, my favorite podcasts are those that I have done with Mary Jo Irmen, who wrote the book Farming Without the Bank. I love our conversations back and forth. What I love about that, again, it goes back to her and I believe our thought processes are very much in alignment together. So it is very exciting. We have a lot of agreement with what we do, although we have some disagreements, and those can be pretty exciting as well. So those are some of my favorite podcasts. And those were earlier on. One with a gentleman called Monty Flack, and we called it You Can't Finance a Funeral. So we talk about his story about when his stepdad died. He was a teacher. He had to pay for a funeral he had no money for. And so the angst in that just reached back to my why a lot more, because I tell the story all the time of I had two brothers. One had life insurance, the other one didn't, right? One was willing to have a conversation with me. One wasn't willing to have a conversation with me. And just the difference in those two paths of those two families. And so I had a lot of empathy with what he was trying to tell me and the story he was trying to get across. His emotion and his struggles with that emphasized him, just really reinforced what I do is like, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, is having this conversation with people, right? And that was one. And another one, there was a gentleman where we talked about that his position was everybody is in a family business. And this one really stuck with me as well, because his struggle is if you're in a business, even if you're in just any kind of business with your family and you're trying to pass to the next generation, you got internal struggles. That conversation was huge. And I've had a lot of response with that one. And that was fun because that was one that I hadn't really thought about. I was kind of aware of it, but I hadn't really thought about it to the depth that he was into it. And so the value he can bring to the listeners was huge. And it had really nothing to do with IBC, although at the end, we kind of decided that when people have control of the banking function and they have liquidity, it makes family struggles a lot easier. It doesn't make them any better. It just gives them an avenue that they have liquidity and cash at the time when somebody in the family passes away. So those are some of the keys. And I would say probably the most fun I've had was our series we did on becoming your own banker. This was one that, quite honestly, surprised me a little bit. I did a series with a gal that just getting into infant banking. She's like, I want to do this. I want to learn this. So she's become certified with the Nelson Nash Institute. She wants to help people understand infant banking as well. And I said, well, let's do a podcast together. It was just real innocent. And I thought it was going to be like a one show, maybe two show type of thing. And we grabbed Nelson's book, Becoming Your Own Banker by R. Nelson Nash. And if you want to go to sagewellstrategy.com, you can see that podcast there. And you can also see the book that's there. Or you can just shoot me an email at wade@sagewellstrategy, and I can give you the link for it. But we took his book and we took each chapter and we did a podcast. And some chapters actually worked into 2 or 3 podcasts because it got to be a little longer. And we ended up with 28 podcasts on that. And that was super exciting. That was probably one of the funnest series of podcasts that I can say I've done, because it was in-depth enough to bring you real value. You can grab a chapter. If somebody's got a question, now what's real helpful is somebody's got a question about a certain thing that's in the book, I can refer them back over to, hey, listen to this podcast because there's some great insight. Not only my insight, but insight from somebody that's just starting down that pathway. You know how it is, Mike, when you do something for 15, 18 years, you kind of think what you're saying and what you're thinking, everybody's thinking. But that's 15 or 18 years worth of experience that it's hard to kind of go back to somebody that's just starting down that journey. And so the conversation with her was bringing her experience and her lens into that conversation. So that was super exciting.
Yeah. So knowing that and kind of, like I said, going through the journey of 1 to 99, what have you learned and what are you taking forward with you into the next phase of this? 101 on, how's that?
Yeah, it's funny when you first start this process and when you challenged me and you said, hey, let's get 100 podcasts. Let's get to that 100th podcast. And that was the challenge that you threw down to me. And I'm like, okay, you're on. Let's see if we can get this done. My thought was, I'm like, 100 podcasts. How are we going to do 100 podcasts? My thought was it was going to be all scattered, right? We're going to talk about all these different subjects, which is good from an initial standpoint. But what I learned, again, what we talked about earlier, it really narrowed, I won't say narrowed, it focused our view and focused our conversations about how do we empower those people that are listening to become the best, become to their maximum potential, right? So it's for our clients and for our listeners to say, we want to focus this conversation and any future conversations down to those things that can empower people to become the maximum they could possibly be in their lives. And give them the tools, give them the thought process. Really what we want to do now going forward is maybe a little bit deeper and make people think a little bit deeper, because again, the exercise we want people to get into is to think differently and get out of the conditioned thinking that we've been in, that we've been trained to think. And we've been trained to think by what's on the TV, what's in the news, what the group think is around the water cooler, but we're getting the same crappy results. And if you want the same crappy results, you do the same crappy procedures. And so I want people to start thinking like, hey, I need to break away from that herd a little bit and start thinking a little bit differently. And who else is thinking like I am? So now we're creating this community. And that's really where I want to go going forward, is creating this community of people that are not thinking the same, but are in alignment with their values. Because ultimately what this podcast has kind of shown me is that my ultimate job is to align people's values with their actions. I can help them understand what their values are and what's important to them. And then the podcast brings in, okay, here's some action items. Here's some things that we can do for you to take action. Because that action married with your values and understanding of those values makes you on a completely different plane than most people that are out there.
So knowing that, and I think you do this well already, but you use a lot of your own life experiences, your own personal little anecdotes, whatnot, to kind of illustrate and tell those stories. And you actually mentioned that with the Monty Flack interview, that kind of shared his story, which I think helps illustrate the reality of some of these things for people and how IBC works and why this is important and all those things. So knowing that going forward, can we expect more stories like that kind of illustrate the real life examples? And what's kind of your thought process on how you're going to continue to communicate it? Because I think one of the struggles with IBC, and hopefully you agree with me, is that it's not something you understand on the first pass. So sometimes you got to hear it from different angles, and you kind of have to immerse yourself to some degree to get those dots to connect.
Yeah, you do. There's a couple things there. I would agree that again, because we've been so conditioned to think one way, rarely do we find somebody that will automatically get out of that. And a lot of times when I've talked to clients and I've talked to other agents, they're searching. They're looking for a better way. They don't know what that way is yet, but they're looking for a better way. So the first characteristics of somebody that is able to get out of that is they're able to have an open mind. Nelson talked about the arrival syndrome. If you have the arrival syndrome, which means you know everything, you've learned everything there is to learn, there's nothing I can teach you. And so probably not going to be a client of mine. But those that are looking and searching because they instinctively know that there's a better way to go about the finances in their lives, those are the people that are coming to me. So it does take some time. Read it. My own personal experience, right? So I read Nelson Nash's book, 2006. Right. So I picked the book up. I read it. I'm like, again, I've been in the industry at that time for 16 years. So I had a lot of the arrival syndrome. So I picked up the book, yeah, there's something there, but yeah, I don't need to know that. But it kept nagging on my brain. And I'm like, picked it up again. I read it. I'm like, there's something there. I should really learn more about this. But I set it down. Third time I picked it up. And this is over the span of about 8 months, the better part of a year, right? And I picked it up again. I read it. I'm like, I really need to know what this man is telling me. And so I actually called the number for the Nelson Nash, it wasn't called the Nelson Nash Institute, and called the number expecting a secretary to tell me that Nelson is busy. But I picked up the phone, and here was this southerly, fatherly figure on the other side of the phone. He goes, Nash here. I'm like, here's Nelson Nash, the guy that wrote this book. And I said, Mr. Nash, I said, I've read your book. There's something there that I just feel like I need to know more about. He says, would it be possible if I flew down to Birmingham, Alabama, and took you out to dinner? And he says, I tell you what, we're having what we call our think tank. This is like-minded people like you. He said, I'll just invite you down to that. And that way you can buy me dinner and you can hear from other people that are having the same struggles as you. And so I went down to that thing, and that started my pathway. But it took me the better part of a year, and reading the book 3 times and calling this guy and finding out that there's a whole other world out there that I hadn't been exposed to. And what made me so mad, what pissed me off the most was this is my industry. This is what I was in. And I hadn't heard about it, right? So how do people that aren't there find it? And so that putting the dots together, it does take some time. It does. And education is a process. It's never an event. And so if you think, I don't get it, well, that's the first run on it. Let's take the second run at it. Let's take the third run at it. I've been doing it now since 2006. So what's that? 15 years. I'm still learning. That was why doing that podcast with Nicole Tate around the book was so exciting, because I was reading this and looking at this book in ways I'd never looked at it the other previous 50 or 60 times I'd read the book. It was because I kept an open mind. It's like, what can I learn from it this time? And then it was sinking in, new stuff was coming back to me all the time.
Yeah.
That was the end of your question. So the beginning part of your question was, can we expect more stories? Yeah, I think how we teach people and how we connect with people is our life experience. I tell the story of how when I was 13 years old, my dad passed away. And 6 months before that, the banker said, hey, that life insurance policy you have, that's expensive. So once you get rid of that, because things were tight on the farm back in the 80s, right? 6 months later, he dies. We have no liquidity. The banker that told him to drop that life insurance policy comes to my mom and says, hey, you got to sell the farm in order to pay the note. 6 months past that, we're selling the farm. But that feeling of utter, we were completely vulnerable to the bank to tell us what to do. Now, I was 13 years old, but I remember the look on my face and the struggle my mother went through. That's what I want people to understand, is like, you can take control of that. You don't have to be in the same position my mother was or my family was, because I'm here to help you. I'm here to empower you to take control of that. So those type of stories are going to be part of my learning and part of my teaching, because if you don't have that experience, I don't know how you can teach that or how you can get that across to people.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important, and you never know which version of which story is going to resonate with people, because I've heard lots of these stories over the years we've been working together, and some stand out more than others, but I think that's going to be kind of the same for anybody who listens to your podcast. So I think the stories are great. I think they play well. I think they attract like-minded people. And yeah, I just wanted to ask that question because I think it's important for the next phase of it, and to honestly, to not get bored with it. I have my own podcast. I know what the journey looks like, and I'm not saying I'm bored with mine, but sometimes you're reinventing the mousetrap with every recording, and it's like, okay, how do I do this one differently, or what do I pull from this conversation that's kind of either gonna build upon what I already have, or it's gonna present it in a new way.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of that is anybody's experience. I listen to your experience. I listen to my client's experience. That's how we kind of relate and say, I can empathize with what you're feeling. I see why you do what you do. And I'm very passionate about people understanding my why before we talk about what and how. We talk about that all the time. If you understand what your why is, why do we do what we do? Why are we sacrificing? Why are we changing? Why are we going through this metamorphosis about how we think about money and finance and so on and so forth? If you don't know what your why is, it's easy to give up. But if you understand what your why is, so that's why I like to share what my why is. And then hopefully we can get to what your why is, or the listener's why, or somebody else going, I hadn't thought about it that way. And so the stories sometimes, I had a guy tell me, again, going back to what we said earlier, he says, I heard you tell that story years ago. But he says, it didn't resonate with me until like right now, because something happened with him in his life. So it's about timing. It's not about, they didn't really care about what I was saying. It was like, oh, now I see it through a different lens. And so it's about timing. And quite honestly, it's, you got to have fun with what we're doing. And if we can't have a real open and honest discussion with our audience, and hopefully we get that feedback from them, if they're out there commenting or posting on wherever you're listening to the podcast from, it's not as much fun if we don't have that back and forth with people. Because then it's just like, I'm up on the pulpit preaching, and I don't want to preach. I want to have an interaction. I want to have conversations with people. I want to understand what's happening in your life more important than what's happening with mine. I share my stories just so you understand where I'm coming from. But the bigger and more important part of that is I want to understand where you're coming from. What's your pain? What are you trying to solve for? And if you hear my story and I hear what you're saying, we can find if our values are in alignment. And if our values are in alignment, we're going to have a great time working together. If what you believe isn't what I believe, and your values aren't in alignment with my values, maybe we shouldn't work together, because we're probably both aren't going to be like super happy with each other. But I can find you somebody that has that same set of values. I can help you. Maybe I can't find it, but I can help you search for that, because you want to work with people. This is a long-term relationship, and we shouldn't get into do business with each other, because quite honestly, that's what we're doing. I have a client. I'm inviting him into my business. He's also inviting me into his business. So we become business partners. And you don't want to be in business with somebody that you don't have an alignment of values with. So going back to the stories and the things to keep it fresh, definitely want to start changing up. We'll be going live and having them on YouTube. And so you can see this handsome mug with the hairy face, both Mike and I. So we can do those things a little bit different. We want to bring different mediums, because people learn and listen and experience the message we're trying to deliver in different ways, right? We have written blogs, we have podcasts, hopefully we'll have video. So we want everybody to have multiple ways of hearing our message.
Yeah. So you've talked about education, you've talked about kind of the journey and whatnot. So this question is not for Wade, the wealth strategist. This question's for Wade, the podcaster. What have you learned in 99 episodes?
What I've learned. You know what the hardest part, Mike, is to learn to shut up. Especially when you have people on your podcast. If I'm doing a podcast all by myself, then I'm trying to get a certain point across. But learn to listen to what the story that people have to share with you. That's super important. Let them be the star, right? It's their journey, and you have them on your podcast, so you can learn from them, quite frankly. And I've worked on that for lots of years, and I think I've become very good at that. So from a podcaster, it's like, let's hear what they have to say. The other part is, let's ask some questions maybe they haven't had before. And I heard this from you one time, and I took that to heart. I want to help them craft their message so people that are listening to my podcast would want to listen to them. I don't need them to talk in depthly about numbers, because that's not who I am, and that's not who my clients are, or my listeners are. So from a podcast, I want to learn, but I also want to bring those two together, meld his knowledge and his understanding and what he's talking about to what we're trying to do as well. So hopefully we find a good fit, because that's what I think makes it really entertaining. And again, they don't always have to agree with what I have to say, but I want to make sure we have the same set of values. Other hard things that we do from podcasting is try to keep I don't say it's a hard thing. You always try to keep a consistent message. And if you understand your why and you understand your values, you typically keep that message very consistent. It's not the same message, but it's just a consistency in the message, right? And so we try to do that. The other thing that I would probably consider the hardest is finding people outside of my sphere of thought process. Because again, I want to fight that conditioned thinking. I want to fight the arrival syndrome. And that's a hard thing to do. As much as I try, as much as I focus, I want to bring in people that challenge me. I want to bring in people that think differently than me, just to make sure that what I'm saying and what you're hearing as a listener and what you're learning from me is true, because it's about having that truth there. So those are some of the things you try to balance when you have a podcast. You obviously want to have it entertaining, but you also want to have them walk away with one or two things like, I hadn't thought of it that way, or I need to talk to Wade because he's saying something that I want to learn more about. Because I don't know that we can teach everything you need to know on a podcast. Quite frankly, that's the exact opposite of what we want to do, because then we're no different than the Dave Ramseys of the world of dispensing information, to the masses when it's never about you, it's about the masses. So we want to make sure that people understand that this is just a general thought, but in order to make something specifically for you, we have to have a separate conversation with you.
Yeah. And I think it's important that, I mean, obviously you're learning as you go. You're trying to refine the message and you're trying to just honestly just kind of get better at it. But I think it's important to point out, not only because I'm sure you've learned this too, but to point it out for potential guests, listeners, whatever, is that there is a little bit of production value that goes into doing a podcast, but I would say the hardest part, or the part you have to learn, is to just be natural and to have conversations. And like, I think we have a tendency to kind of want to be a radio host. Like when we're on a podcast, we like think we're Howard Stern all of a sudden. And it's like, no, it doesn't have to be that over the top. It just needs to be, obviously you got to stick to your plan and your why and whatnot, but you just have to be natural and connect with people.
Yeah. And you got to be genuine. I think that's the real key. And have a thought to where you want to go, right? I will say that my blueprint, my style is very open forum, for lack of a better words. I make about 4 or 5 bullet points I want to talk about. And then we just get into the conversation, because again, I think it's about the conversation. That relationship I'm having with the person at the other end, like you and I are having, it's about that relationship. And so I don't necessarily want to script it, because then it's all about me. Again, I want to learn about you. And so sometimes that goes a little bit awry, but that's fine too, because it's not polished production. It's live. It's real. There's nothing, we don't take 5 takes at this thing. We just get on and we talk about what's important to us, how this plays into life. And we try to say, always kind of approach it like, I was telling my son, I have this conversation. We're actually at Scouts, and he's in Scouts, and I'm one of the troop leaders, and we're having this discussion with the kids. I said, if you want to go fishing, you can't just hop in the boat and let it drift, right? You got to put your motor down eventually, because you got to know the location where you want to fish. You got to put your motor down, which is your thought process, your mind, and then you have to drive the boat to that location, because you're not going to drift to that location. It never happens. So we have to have that location that we want to get to, and then say, how do we get there? You might have to go around an island. You might have to go around a point, a rock, shawl, or whatever it might be to get to that point. But we have to drive ourselves there. And if we're in that drifting mode, we're going to go wherever the wind blows us versus having a destination. And so we want to make sure in our conversations that we're driving to a point. Now we can have a lot of fun getting there, because it might be a lot of ins and outs and around different islands, but eventually we want to get to a point. And that's to engage people, to have them think and have them want to engage, to change. Again, I'm going to go back to the farming analogy. We want to help them pull the weeds out of their garden so they can grow and nurture what they want to do. Now, how we get there, that can be a lot of fun, but eventually that's where we want to go.
That's awesome. I think people appreciate just holistically, but also I think the listeners of your podcast, obviously they're your people, or they probably wouldn't be listening, but I think they're picking up on that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I said, it's been fun. The feedback I've gotten, especially lately, because we've been around long enough, what I found about podcasting is that if you throw out one every month or so, people don't pick up on it. It's got to be consistent. It's got to be out there, because again, and you've taught me a lot about podcasts, is that podcasting is not linear. It's like they'll hop in episode 65 and go, oh, this is great stuff. Then they go back to episode 24, and then they hop over to episode 98. And it's not a linear thought process. So it's like you have to be consistent and you have to be out there doing it. And what excites me about that, and especially as we go into, when we go towards episode 200, is that we're making an impact. We're sharing my message. I'm so excited because I can share knowledge and what's happened in my life and just experience I've seen with other clients' lives. I can share that with you. I can share that with so many more people than I can by just having a one-on-one conversation. And so being able to put some of this knowledge and some of these experience out there for other people to learn from, so they don't have to have skin knees. I had this conversation with a bunch of agents that we're training and we're doing some mentorship with. I said, you can either skin your knees for 2 years, or you can listen to a person that skinned his knees for 2 years and have been around for 35 years. And hopefully we can take that skin knees down from 2 years down maybe to 6 months. You still have to skin your knees. You still have to get in and get bloodied a little bit. But hopefully that time frame is a lot shorter, right? And so that's going to be the fun part going forward, is like making sure that those experiences and that message is getting out there so people can go, oh man, I learned so much from this podcast. Like I've learned from some other podcasts. I'm like, oh, I've learned so much from this podcast that I'm not going to make this mistake. I'm not going to make this mistake, and I'm not going to make this mistake. Or I can take advantage of this opportunity. I can take advantage of this opportunity. I can take advantage of this opportunity.
Yep.
That I hadn't thought about before until I started listening to this podcast. But it's not a linear process. So we have to keep doing this for people to have true value in it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answered your question, but it seemed like that was what's flowing. So
no, it did.
So, but
I don't know, Wade, I don't know if you have more you want to cover. I thought there was a lot there.
Just to the point of, I never imagined getting to 100. I think sometimes we struggle to get to 10, and then we struggle to get to 20. And you can probably attest to that because so much other stuff is going on. It takes time and energy and thought to do a podcast once or twice or 3 times a week. It's not something that you can just hop on and do, and you can probably do that 1 or 2 times, but I never thought I would get to 100. Now I can't imagine not getting to 200. That's right. The exciting part. And it's everybody that's listened to 1 or 2 podcasts, or somebody that's listened to all 100, bless your heart. Thank you so much, because this has been fun. This has been exciting for me. Just it's a medium that I can get my knowledge and my understanding of what's going on out there for everybody to hear. And you can pick and choose what part of that is most important to you. So again, thank you for all that have listened. I'm super excited to get to 200. So when we get to 200, Mike, we're going to do something big. I don't know what that is, but we're going to do something big. Maybe we'll get balloons and flowers. How's that?
Right. And the only other thing that I would add is that having a podcast myself, it's one more thing. So you're a business owner, you have clients, you have relationships, you have a lot of stuff on your plate. And a podcast is one more thing. It's worth it. It's fun. And there's definitely an upside to it, but it's a commitment. So to get to 100, that's a major milestone, because you had to sit down at least 100 times and have those conversations, spend that time, exude the brain power, and then everything that we had to do to produce it and to get it launched and to get it out there to your listeners. So just a yay for Wade. That was a commitment, and it's a big animal, big mountain to climb.
Well, and thank you. I appreciate that. It was your challenge to me that made it happen. So that's why I was so excited to have you on for the 100th podcast, because without you, without your team, I just don't know that I would have made it, just because there's so many things that were going on, and you're persistent and you try to move us forward. So you did move us forward. You just didn't try. So thank you so much for that persistency. And it was a team effort. So thank you for your help and for your team's help. And I'm so grateful from the standpoint of, I'm so glad I did it, because it's been a lot of fun, and I just look forward to the next 100 that we do.
Yeah. Awesome.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks everybody for listening.
Thanks for having me on.
If you're enjoying this podcast, or know anyone else that might be interested, please be sure to hit the subscribe button, and please leave a review. This will help this podcast reach and help more people by ranking higher in searches, and ultimately help more people get out of financial bondage. And don't be afraid to share this podcast with your friends and family, as we can be easily found on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.